Need help? Call our cybersecurity team and book a consultation with us today.
So tonight we're going to cover network troubleshooting. This is a really challenging topic to try to teach because usually when you learn troubleshooting, it involves maybe a specific issue or something like that. And to try and instead teach a mindset of how to do troubleshooting is a little more challenging. Robert and I have tried this a few times over the years with some mixed results. So we're going to give it another try. I've got a little bit different take than the last time I did it, which was probably about 3 years ago. So we're going to go ahead and give it a try. If you have any questions, if something's not clear, or you have some feedback, like you want to make a point or you want to bring up a specific thing, you can just go ahead and interrupt me in real time. Just take yourself off of mute and ask. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can go ahead and use the chat and send a message in chat. I will warn you, since I'm presenting and my partner in crime, Robert Yee, is not here tonight, I may not see the chats until we get to the end. That's okay. I'll stick around and answer anything that's in chat if I don't see it. I will try to keep my eyes open, and I do get a little pop-up. But if I don't notice it, just be assured it won't go anywhere. I will eventually get to it, okay? So and for next month, I think we're going to try to do a hands-on event. So we did one of these a few months ago where we did an OSPF lab. Everyone did some OSPF. I think we're going to do a capture the flag event around data center networking, a product called Nexus Dashboard. I was hoping to do that this month, but Robert could not be here tonight, and I need someone from Cisco to run the capture the flag part of the event. I don't have access. So we're trying to work on being able to do that in at the next month, which will be our 23rd birthday. We turn 23 next month, actually. So anyway, with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned at the top, we're covering network troubleshooting. For those who don't know me, my name's Jason. I work for a company called LA-Networks. We've been a co-sponsor of SCUG pretty much since the beginning. In fact, the group was founded by Robert and I, like I said, in July of '99. And that's actually how Robert and I met. We met at the first public meeting of the Cisco user group, and we've been great friends ever since. So if you do have follow-up questions as well, you can just email me. My email is at the bottom of the intro slide here, or just hit a chat to me in the meeting notes, and I will give it to you then, or however you would like to reach me is fine. Let's go ahead and dive right in. There we go. Okay, just a quick overview on the agenda for tonight, right? So we're gonna take a fairly layered approach, pun intended. So we'll start with kind of like, where do we start and what do we consider when we're doing troubleshooting? But then we're going to start working the layers. We're going to work the OSI model, and probably everyone on the call is somewhat familiar with the OSI model. And it shouldn't be too surprising, hopefully, that that's where we start with our troubleshooting. If we don't know where to go. Now, anyone from my company who happens to be on knows that my #1 rule when I'm doing training is any rule I give you could be broken. You just need to know why you would want to break it and when to break it, right? If you're kind of newer to networking, don't break these rules, I would say, not until you've got some more experience under your belt. But, there are people who can say, well, I know this doesn't seem likely to be a physical layer issue. I'm going to start at the network layer or the data link layer or something like that. But for purposes of tonight, we're just going to work the layers in the order: physical, data link, network, and transport. You'll see that I stop at transport. That's because most, I'm not saying all, but most network problems end at the transport layer. If it's above the transport layer or if it's spanning multiple layers, then we're going to probably need to get other people involved other than just people from the networking team. Okay. And then we'll go into kind of how to break down some of the more common problems based on their problem category. That's like, hey, how do I break down a problem if someone's reporting something's down or something's slow, etc. And then we'll wrap with just some general tips I have for when you're doing troubleshooting in real time. I think it'll probably take about 70 to 80 minutes to cover this tonight, but we'll see. I did a dry run last week, and it clocked in around 90. I've actually shortened it a little bit, so we'll see where it goes. And again, if you have questions, feel free just to ask. If you put them in the chat window, I will do my best to answer them in real time, but if not, I'll answer them at the end. Oh, someone asked, will we get a copy of the slides? So we usually, if you email me, I'll get you a copy of the slides, and then let me just put it into chat real quick. Two things. First, I'll put my email address. You can always email me, and I'll just send you the slides directly. And I put my email in the chat. The other thing is you can always go to our website, scug.net, and it sometimes takes a week. We go through a marketing company, but if there are slides, we typically put them up there maybe about a week or so after the meeting. And then they stay up there for for basically that calendar, for about a calendar year, and then they come down to save on space for the website. So good question. Oops. Okay, so where do we start? And what do we want to consider when we're troubleshooting? So, this was definitely something I learned the hard way in my own career back in the 90s when I first started doing networking. I would immediately jump onto command lines and just start running commands kind of willy-nilly to try and figure out what was broken and everything else. Now I move a lot more slowly. That sounds bad, but I think it's a good thing, right? I slow down and I ask myself some key questions. What's being reported? And then what is really at issue here? And these are often different things, right? Not too long ago, I had someone who's reporting like, hey, my VDI is down. Okay, so they're telling me what's being reported is that their VDI is down. But what's really at issue is I start to ask some questions about it. I realize they can get to their VDI, so their VDI is up, but their VDI cannot get to other services, right? I had one when I was on call a couple of weeks ago. The VPN to our office is down. Oh, okay. Well, it started off with my firewall is down, and then he said, well, it's just the VPNs that are down. And I said, okay, so there's no way for me to connect to the firewall. He goes, well, I can show you the firewall because I'm VPN'd in. And so I thought the VPNs were down. He goes, I'm sorry, I'm on a site-to-site VPN from home, but remote access VPNs are down. Slowing down and asking those questions like, okay, you're telling me your firewall's down, but what is really at issue? And you narrow that down by just asking questions like, okay, I hear you're saying that your VDI is down. So that means you can't connect to it in any way. No, I can connect to it, but I can't get anywhere. Ah, okay. So that's what's really at issue here. And then you can narrow it down from there. And when I say that, it makes it sound possibly like I'm bad mouthing the client or something, and I'm not at all. They're not a networking expert. The people on this call are networking experts, right? I'm a networking expert. So it's just a matter of translation. We want to make sure we slow down and translate properly what they're reporting and then what the real issue might be or what they're really seeing or experiencing. What is the impact or scope of the issue, right? So is this impacting just one person's workstation at a particular office? Is it impacting everyone in the HR department or everyone in a particular corner of the building or an entire site or the entire company? Try to get some scope on this. Obviously, if it's impacting everyone in the company, that's Sev1 type material, right? If it's impacting a single user and everyone else is fine, we should do our due diligence. We should work the layers, but we need to be aware that it may well not be a network issue. If they have a single workstation that's down, it might be, oh, maybe their AD's out of sync or something, or maybe there's a problem with the DHCP scope. So try to understand what the impact or the scope of the issue is, right? This one's probably obvious, but it's funny how much it doesn't get asked, and that is what has changed recently. So recently, did anything change? So when I was mentioning that firewall issue, and they definitely were not trying to hide anything. I was like, has there been any change? Because I knew that the firewall had been up earlier in the day. And they said, yeah, we changed a lot of stuff tonight. We changed that to new DNS servers. We changed that to new Active Directory servers. We upgraded a whole bunch of Windows stuff. Okay, right. And remote access VPN is working, but site-to-site VPN is broken. We're probably looking at some kind of an LDAP issue, right? Which is exactly what was going on. Now, they had a couple of things going on, but that was the big one, right? So what has changed recently? And it's important that you kind of listen in on those, because what has changed recently can actually change itself over time. I was on a call not too long ago, and they were saying like, well, nothing's really changed. This has been working for months, no changes. And the person reporting it was being very honest. There had been no changes from their perspective. But then we got someone from the InfoSec team on, and they said, well, actually, we did push new policy last night on the firewalls in between his VDI and the rest of the corporate network. Okay, so there was a firewall policy change. Can you please take a look and see, are you getting denies on that from this IP address, right? Yes, I am. Okay, we need to revert that change, or we need to troubleshoot it somehow, right? So what changed recently? And keep your ears open, because maybe not everyone that you need to talk to is on the phone at the right time. So you might get new information on what changed recently. What's the change control process for wherever you're working, right? I have some customers that if something's down and it's critical, change control kind of goes out the window, right? They're just like, just get it done and we can document it afterwards. And we'll talk about that. I have other customers that, they're in highly, highly regulated environments. And their point of view might be, the audit I'm going to get from this outage is already going to cost me enough money. I need the change control process to be followed so I don't have yet one more item that I'm going to get audited on. So just know ahead of time when you're going into these sorts of things, what's that change control process look like? And then communicate clearly and often, both internally and externally. For me, internally and externally means internally to the other engineers at LA Networks, and externally means externally to my customers and my clients. But I haven't always been, a consultant at a VAR. I used to work at a number of different companies. And so internally and externally might have meant internally to my networking team or internally to IT in general. And externally might have meant anyone in IT but not on the networking team, or externally might have meant other people within the company that are being affected by this. But think about it in your own life. We all like to have clear and frequent communication when there's a stressful event like an outage, right? And so communicating clearly and often puts everyone at ease. Now, don't do it so often that you can't troubleshoot, although it's fine. Quite a few years ago now, I guess, I was working at a movie studio that was merging with another movie studio, and we had dedicated project managers that just sat and worked with us, and they handled all the communication. So I would just give them verbal updates, and then they would kind of summarize it into note form, show it to me for 30 seconds. I'd say, yeah, and then they'd send it out to the company, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be you doing the communication, although in my experience, 99% of the time it is. Any questions or thoughts on this one before I move on? Okay, great. So like I said, we're going to work the layers. And when I say the layers, I mean the layers of the OSI model. We really just, in networking, we really usually just deal with 4 of the 7 layers, 8 layers if you count the political layer. But we'll deal with the physical layer. That means things like cabling and optics. We'll deal with the data link layer. So think about things like MAC addresses, spanning tree, half of an ARP table. We'll deal with the network layer, the other half of the ARP table, IP addressing in general, routing protocols, overlay technologies. And then the transport layer, which gets a little dicey because the transport layer is where you really start to blur the line between the network. The first 3 layers are very much network centric, and the application, because layers 4 through 7 really deal with the application. And layer 4, that transport layer, is where those lines start to blur. So we're dealing with protocols like TCP, UDP, but we're also dealing with appliances like firewalls and load balancers that might go in the traffic flow and intercept or um, you know, molest packets as they traverse a network. Think about NAT, right? It stops the packet, changes the source IP address, and then sends it back on its way, right? That's pretty intrusive to the packet, right? So when we get into the transport layer, it gets a little more convoluted, and you'll see that when we get into the troubleshooting. But if you don't know where to start, we start with working the layers, and the first layer is the physical layer, right? And you can start by just asking simple questions, right? Do you have a link light? What type of fiber or optic, right? And is it the right combination? You can't take a single mode fiber and plug it into a multi-mode optic and expect it to work. The laser on the optic's too powerful for that fiber, right? Was the fiber exposed to air for a long time? If so, maybe the fiber needs to be cleaned. Or if you don't have a fiber cleaner, maybe it just needs to be replaced, right? Maybe it's not a fiber thing. Maybe it's a copper thing. Maybe it's something like PoE to the switch. You know, do you have enough power to the switch, right? It could also be something that's physical layer, but it's not an Ethernet cable. It could be the stacking cables on the back of a set of Catalyst 9300s or something like that. You know, it's not necessarily at the OSI layer 1, but it kind of is. You know, usually when we think of layer 1, we're thinking of station cabling or cabling between networking devices, not cabling within a virtual stack, right? But it's the same concept. Same thing with power, right? You know, you've got redundant power supplies, but one of the power supplies died overnight and you weren't aware of it, right? So that might be a good example. You might not think of that power supply as physical layer, but I'd lump it in there just because it's a physical thing. And when you have problems like that, and this is really true at every one of these layers, but I find physical layer, it can be really, really true. And that's logs are always your friend, okay? Along with logs, I'd recommend NTP so you have a timestamp on that log. But, you know, it's nice if you can trace this stuff back. And of course, we're not really dealing with security type troubleshooting in this one, but if you have to do security forensics or something, obviously logs are even more critical, right? So yeah, logs in general are really important. Keep in mind that as long as a port is enabled, as long as that port is lit up, so to speak, if you plug something into it, you should get a link light, even if the port is not properly configured, right? So if I'm supposed to have all my systems in VLAN 2 and one port stayed in VLAN 1, if I plug something into it, I should still get a link light. That that something I plugged into it may not work because it's in the wrong VLAN, right? But I should get a link light, and that's the sort of things we're looking at the physical layer. Some of the tools we have when it comes to the physical layer. So my favorite tool by far is I like to always ensure that I have what they call DOM enabled optics, right? And you can tell if an optic is DOM enabled or not. It'll have a D in the part number, at least on Cisco optics. I couldn't tell you on other brands, but when we do quotes for customers, we always use DOM enabled optics by default, unless they demand some other optic. They are a little bit more expensive, but not horrendously more expensive per optic. But the DOM, basically what it is it's a way to measure the level of light on your transmit and your receive. So you can do a command called show interface transceiver, and you could pipe in there like an interface or something like that. If you're troubleshooting interface E1.2 or something, you can do show interface transceiver, pipe to include E1/2 or something like that. And it might tell you things like, oh, I'm sending light just fine, but I'm not receiving any light. My receiving light is not working, right? I'm not receiving anything. So if I'm doing fiber stuff, that DOM capability, it's just a top-notch winner for me. Also just knowing, is this a single mode or multi-mode fiber and optic? And what's the compatibility between these? I see this a lot in data centers, not so much in wiring closets, but in data centers, where someone just assumes all optics are interchangeable. And I used to work in a pretty large data center, about 160 racks total. And one of our top problems was someone would just grab an optic and plug it in, and they'd plug a 1 gig optic into a 10 gig only port, or they would plug in a single mode fiber into a multi-mode optic or something like that. And just being able to use that show interface transceiver command. Oh, someone said, yeah, digital optical monitoring. Yeah, someone asked, I guess what it was. It's hard for me to see the chats. Maybe I could actually, let me try this. Okay. Yeah, I'll try to do this. This might be hard to keep the chat up like that, but we'll try. And then one of the most critical things is just the show interface command. You know, one of the advantages of working with Cisco is they've been around for so long that that they've really refined some of their commands. And like the show interface command, they pack so much information into a single command. And you can do a show interface and you just look for things like errors, right? Do I have input errors or interface resets, CRCs? The slide before, by the way, I should point out, you can also do troubleshooting around, do I have enough power for inline power and things like that, right? And these lists are not exhaustive. I can't exhaustively put every possible command you could use to troubleshoot each of these 4 layers. That'd take a week to go through all that, right? It's just to get you used to that mentality of taking a very structured approach to your troubleshooting, right? You don't know where else to start, you start with the OSI model. We always start with the OSI model at the bottom, layer 1. That's the physical layer. And so we go in and we take a look at things like, what are my light levels? Do I have enough power to the switch? Are my fans okay? What's my cabling plant look like, right? Am I incrementing errors? Now you need to be careful when you use the show interface command. The one problem with that is you could do a show interface and you might see, oh my gosh, I have 280 million CRC errors, right? You might think, oh, this interface is no good. Let's move to another interface, or let's get a new optic in there, whatever. But that's a dangerous attitude, because the problem with the show interface command is it doesn't tell you when those error counters incremented. It could have been in the last hour, or it could have been in the last 4 years, right? Or it might have been in a 1 hour period 4 years ago. So you need to look at the last time the interface counters were cleared, or issue the command multiple times over some kind of time interval and see, are they actively incrementing. 1 second. Sorry, I haven't been talking much today. Of course. Any questions on the physical layer other than the one that already got asked and answered in the chat? Thank you, Sahil. Hopefully I'm saying that properly.
Just one thing that I would add is don't hold the fiber up to your eye to see if there's light.
Yes. Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, there are lasers on these things. If you want to see if there's light coming through the fiber, well, number one, like I said, I use DOM optics if I can, but if not, maybe cup your hand, especially if it's in a darker area, and put it into your hand. See if you can see a light that way. Or they have tools as well that you can use that will measure whether or not you're getting light. If you have a DOM optic, you don't need to do that. But if you don't, you may have to come up with a way. And yes, never, that's a great one. Never take one of these fibers that's plugged into a laser and put it in your eye. That no good's going to come of that. Thank you, John.
Yeah, these days you can actually use your phone camera, but you couldn't do that 20 years ago.
Yeah. So lots of other options. The eye should not be one of them. Good point. Okay, let's move up to layer 2, the data link layer. Right? And what are we talking about at the data link layer? Well, we're talking about things like MAC addresses, VLANs, spanning tree, right? We're also talking about layer 2 technologies like trunking or ether channel. And before anyone brings it up, I know you can do a layer 3 ether channel, but I would say layer 2 ether channels are probably about 90% of the ether channels out there. Layer 3 ether channels definitely are a thing. They do exist. I've configured plenty of them, but I've probably configured 10 layer 2 ether channels for every one layer 3 ether channel I've done, right? And so you're going to issue commands like show MAC address table. I like to use a pipe when I can with that, or maybe tie it to a specific interface or something like that, right? Show spanning tree VLAN and then put in that VLAN number. Show spanning tree 2, show spanning tree 10, whatever your VLAN number is, to figure out where the root switch is and what your root port is. One of the most useful commands for troubleshooting spanning tree, in my opinion, is show span tree block. And that lets you know, do I have any ports that are blocking, right? So did maybe something get cabled wrong, or did I not set my root priority properly? And you could do show spanning tree interface detail. I'm not as big a fan of that one. It's got a lot of information in there. But you need to use the command you kind of need to use, right? A lot of people forget that a switch / VLAN, that's really just a layer 2 technology. Until you do something to route that traffic, a VLAN is only a layer 2 construct, right? It just tells you how far a broadcast is really going to propagate. So now, of course, when you configure an SVI or something along those lines, put a gateway. Once you attach a gateway to a VLAN, then of course the VLAN can route and it becomes layer 3 accessible, but the VLAN itself is still a layer 2 construct. So okay. So again, you're looking mostly at MAC addresses and spanning tree. In the data center, we would also be looking at VPCs. I didn't really go too much into data center stuff in here, but VPCs are kind of like a multi-chassis ether channel for the data center, effectively. Hopefully you've designed your network and it just hasn't grown organically, or you didn't just inherit it. But that's hopefully, and we all know that we kind of get what we get. And sometimes you inherit a network, or when I was first starting out, boy, I made so many mistakes, right? When I used to give this talk, I used to say, I've been doing networking for about 20 years. The first 5 years, I broke a lot of things. The next 15, I spent fixing them. A little bit of a joke, but you get the idea, right? We all grow as engineers, and so maybe you didn't plan out your root bridges because you didn't really understand how spanning tree worked or something like that, right? Hopefully you have, and if you do, you probably have a good idea of, hey, which device is root, and then what port would I expect to block on towards the root for what VLANs, that's, depending on your setup. The show ether channel or show ether channel summary command can be pretty helpful if you're having a problem with ether channel. I had a problem several years ago now. It was in that large data center I was working in, where they had made a patch to Windows that broke the LACP mechanism on the Windows servers. And so I had a bunch of ether channels running down to a bunch of Windows hosts. And on the switch side, the VPC looked up, but only one side was ever receiving traffic. And if you went down to the Windows side, you would see that they had faulted on their end one of the links, and so they were single homed, and we didn't really notice it. I mean, I would not have noticed it, since on the switch it just showed that the VPC was up, but they didn't notice it until they tried to do a maintenance and fail over their links, and suddenly realized it didn't fail over. And we took a look at it, eventually opened up a ticket with HP and opened up a ticket with Windows, and Windows eventually owned it. Show MAC address table. That's a pretty nice one, as I mentioned before. Show interfaces status error disabled. If you have things like port security or storm control that might error disable a port, right? Or port fast with BPDU guard, some of those things, which you should have. Those are good, all good, solid layer 2 technologies. You may want to know what interfaces are in an error disabled state, right? And why are they in an error disabled state? Again, show log helps on everything. Show interface trunk to show you your trunk interfaces and what VLANs are being trunked and what VLANs are being forwarded on the trunk. And for those who didn't know, you can actually do a layer 2 trace route. It's trace route MAC, and then you put in the MAC address, right? So those are all good data link layer troubleshooting tips. Again, not exhaustive, but I think that it gives you a feel for how you want to troubleshoot that. Before I move on to the network layer, any questions here? Okay. So we validated the physical layer and everything looks good. We validated the data link layer, everything looks good. So what do? We move up to the network layer. Probably a little more, well, definitely a lot more complex, but a layer that a lot of us are a little more comfortable at, right? IP addresses, for some of us, we've been working with them for decades. For some of us, maybe not quite that long, but we're all pretty familiar with IP addresses. And so it's a little more comfortable, right? Because that's what we're dealing with, things like routing adjacencies, IP addresses, but be aware that a lot of overlay technologies also happen at the network layer, right? Show IP ARP, you may have to have a liberal use of pipes, depending. If you're doing like a show IP ARP on an SBI interface, and it's a large VLAN, you're probably going to want to use a pipe command to limit the output, right? But the show IP ARP is one of my favorite commands for troubleshooting. If you're troubleshooting routing protocols, maybe focus a little bit on why an adjacency is not forming, right? And remember, we layer everything with those initial steps, like what's the scope, what's really being reported here, what's changed. If you're like, that's sort of weird, all my adjacencies are working except this one adjacency. It's a BGP adjacency that goes to an external vendor, right? And if you go back and look at the change log and you see, oh, last night in change control, someone pushed password updates to our BGP neighbors. So maybe I wasn't supposed to change the one that went to an external partner, or maybe my external partner hasn't executed the change on their side yet or something. But what changed, right? So, but there's a million reasons that adjacencies might not form. On the next slide, we'll go through some of them. Maybe the best command of all time, show IP route. Um, when I was studying for my CCIE, I think this became my favorite command because it puts such an incredible amount of information into such an efficient space, right? You're learning each destination prefix that the router has an entry for, what interface you're going to exit or interfaces, how stable or old the route is, how you learn the route, if there's more than one path available to you, i.e. ECMP. The show IP route command, I can't say enough about how phenomenal a command that is in troubleshooting. It lets you understand how the router is making its forwarding decisions, right? So it's an important command. And just remember that by default, all routing tables are destination based only. So you may need to check in two directions because a traffic flow is source to destination. But when a packet leaves my source, let's say my laptop right now, and it goes somewhere, the route only looks at the destination. It doesn't care where it came from. By default, I know obviously we can override this, but it's pretty rare, right? So it's all destination based. So maybe I'm taking an asynchronous path. I may need to check the path in both directions to see how's the traffic getting back to me as well, right? Some common network layer tools, right? There's the tried and true tools, ping and traceroute. Two of the greatest utilities ever, well, just ever. Ping is now so common that my kids all use it, so that's how common ping has become. They'll say like, hey, can you ping this, um, so traceroute maybe a little less so, but to us, to network folks like you and I, yeah, trace is kind of part of our arsenal, but it's also really critical to do things like getting the proper source and destination. Where's this traffic coming from? Where's it going to? And then understanding the specifics of the protocols that you're trying to support, right? Remembering that routing is destination based. I'm not going to read through all of these. I'll call out a few of my favorites though. Any of the neighbors commands, show IP EIGRP neighbors, show IP OSPF neighbors, show IP BGP neighbors. Those neighbor commands just chock full of great troubleshooting information, right? Show IP BGP summary. BGP is my favorite protocol overall, probably followed by OSPF. And that's not saying that I hate EIGRP. I cut my teeth on EIGRP. I just appreciate the design and architecture of the other two protocols a bit more. EIGRP never ceases to amaze me at how fast it is, right? BGP, not a fast protocol. EIGRP with no tuning is so fast, and with tuning, it's unbelievably fast. So I'm not trying to say don't use EIGRP. I'm just saying of these three, it's probably my third favorite. It's still light years ahead of static routing though. But one command, I won't go into this in depth. I've done BGP talks where we go into this a lot more in depth. Show IP BGP regexp or regexp. It stands for regular expression, and it allows you to type in commands to understand kind of the nature of the BGP routes you're receiving, right? So you could do things like you could say, hey, I want to see all the routes that I have in my BGP table that originate in ASN 1234. I want to see all the routes in my BGP table that pass through ASN 6, whatever. And it's really infinitely flexible on how you want to write those regex, irregular expressions. Again, not going to go through the whole thing, but if you're not familiar with that command, and if you support BGP or you're trying to study BGP, this is a great one. When I'm troubleshooting BGP, if it's not something easy that I can get through with summary and neighbor, my default go-to is always the regular expression command to try and get a feel for what's going on with my BGP table, especially if I'm on a router taking full routes or something like that. Okay, that's about it for the network layer. Before I move on to transport, any comments, questions, thoughts? Let me check the chat real quick too. Okay. Looks like we're good. Okay. Okay, so transport layer. We're making really pretty good time. So this one's definitely a little more complex to troubleshoot. And part of it is the transport layer often involves other products, which might have different commands. So I'm not going to go into as many commands. It's also a little bit more complicated. That being said, the transport layer is really where the rubber meets the road between applications and the network, right? So it's really critical, right? So we're dealing with ports and protocols here, right? TCP, UDP, ICMP, etc., right? And then, ports, 8443, TCP 80 and TCP 443 for web servers, for example. So it's really how the application moves off of the network layer and into the higher layers for processing at the application layer itself eventually, right? And it's where we see the most appliances inserted into the network for interception, right? So this is where we'll see things like firewalls, load balancers, and WAN optimizers. There's other appliances that might go in here, or there might be appliances that do multiple things. Because it's where appliances are most commonly inserted into the network, that's one of the reasons that it gets a little more complicated. I can't just say show connections, because that might work on your ASA, but it might not work on your FTD, and it might not work on your, A10 load balancer or something like that, right? But be aware that these appliances, I'm not saying they always do this, but they like to intercept traffic and change it somehow, right? So if you've got a load balancer, it likes to put a VIP out there and say, hey, if you're trying to get to ldap.xyzcorp.com, you want to come to 10.10.10.6. But really, I'm going to load balance you between 10.100.10.6.7.8 or something like that, right? So it kind of has to proxy that connection across. And because we're going to get in the middle of things like that, and load balancers are usually, as I mentioned, tied into things like DNS, well, suddenly they might get tied to protocols we might not normally think of or own on the network layer, right? Think about firewalls. I mentioned that earlier. WAN optimizers, we don't see WAN optimizers as frequently as we used to because bandwidth has become prevalent with internet WANs becoming dominant. Internet WANs have become really dominant, I think, because of enabling technologies like SD-WAN, right? So WAN optimizers are still around, but they're a lot less common than they used to be. Personally, I think I say good riddance. I was never a fan of WAN optimizers, which often would break things like TCP protocols, and they would get in and try to manually manipulate windowing and acknowledgements and things like that. And you could get really good performance, but you could also do things like update your server infrastructure or your NFS mounts, and all of a sudden all your apps are broken across your entire enterprise. Um, so I'm not a huge fan of WAN optimizers. They're still out there. They're just not as common as they used to be. And I'm not necessarily saying if you have WAN optimizers, you should rip them out. If you're happy with your WAN optimizers, if they're bringing you true value, then absolutely keep them. I just see them less and less as bandwidth has become more and more available at a reasonable price point. And I would say compared to firewalls and load balancers, they had a much higher application impact than the other two. So, like I said, it is a little bit tougher to troubleshoot here because you need to have some understanding of the application. I think I've talked about this when I do design clinics for the user group, but don't look at this as a downside, look at this as an upside, because anytime you understand an application, you've just become more valuable to the business. That's a good thing. You know, networking people and myself, I was guilty of this when I was younger. Um, a lot of times we like to pretend like I'm a network person. I don't care about the app, you know. Yeah, that's an attitude that I think doesn't get us anywhere any longer because software has won. Software rules the world. So we need to always be worried about our apps because our apps are what drive our business, right? So anytime you can better understand an app, you're making yourself more valuable to the company that you're working for. So that's a good thing. It's just not where our strength always lies, right? And so it's a little bit of a heavier lift, but I think it's a very worthwhile lift, right? Now, it might be something simple like a web app. Well, that's one thing. That's not too bad, right? It's 80 and 443, or maybe it's just 443 or something. I don't know. Or maybe you're running on a special port 8080, but you know, that's pretty straightforward. What happens when it's a homegrown app and the developer of that app left a while ago? That gets a lot more difficult. I think I saw a question just pop up. 1 second here. Oh, so yeah, Wireshark or Packet Tracer or tools like that, right? Um, so Wireshark is, Wireshark's a phenomenal tool. And sniffers are great at the transport layer. And a lot of these appliances that we talked about earlier, like firewalls and load balancers, often have built-in packet capture capabilities. These days, I think everyone uses Wireshark for the most part for their packet captures. I know I do. Um, and everything will usually spit out to a PCAP style format so you can read it in Wireshark. But Doug, that's a great point. Yeah, transport layer, sniffers or packet captures. I wouldn't say that they're my number one go-to, but when nothing else can fix that problem, a lot of times that's the only way to fix that problem. So it's a great call out, and I should have had it in here. Thank you for that, Doug. So I did have a situation at a biomedical company I was doing some work for probably 7 or 8 years ago, where they had this problem with this app. They had a very homegrown custom app. It had tons of complex architecture, really complicated, and the dev team that had created it was mostly one person and then a few other people had helped. They had left the company. So what do you do then when that app is having problems, right? What do you do when your F5 load balancer is breaking your app, which is exactly what happened. We didn't know it was the F5 at the time. It eventually ended up being that they'd patched one of the services and had changed a port or something like that. It was a while ago, but so it gets a little challenging, you know. Whoops, sorry. So commands will vary device by device, but some things you could be looking for are the TCP handshakes occurring properly? What are your active connections? What's the health of those active connections? Do you have any half-open connections? You know, you could be getting DOSed or DDoSed. You might see a bunch of halfway or embryonic connections. 1 second. Sorry, I'm really getting a little bit hoarse. I apologize. Check the HA status, right? So that you understand who forwarded what. We had this happen on an SD-WAN project a little while back where someone was like, hey, I've got 2 appliances and while both look up in the management station, one of them isn't forwarding any traffic. And at first, in the heat of the moment, at the end of a multi-hour cut, you're like, oh no, how's that happening? And then you realize, wait, they're active passive. Of course it's up and not forwarding traffic because the other traffic's the only one who's doing any forwarding, right? If it's active, then they're both forwarding. So know about those things. Is there a NAT involved, right? I was doing some project in Oklahoma a while back, and they subscribed to a service that still used whitelisted public IP space, and so they'd changed out their ISP, and that meant that they received new public IP space. They didn't own their own public IP space, and so when they changed that NAT, it broke some things, right? Actually, it broke some kind of critical things. So yeah, those are all potential things you're going to have to troubleshoot. Sorry, I think I saw another check. Yeah, that was just Doug pointing out. Yeah, it's a really good tool. The Wireshark, it is. Okay, we're in the home stretch, folks. But before I move off of the OSI stuff, any questions or comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a comment.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing more and more TLS handshaking issues. Now that a lot of companies are disallowing version 1.0 and 1.1,
Yeah.
you've still got people out there using Windows Server 2003,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. And yeah, so more and more that's falling on the network team to troubleshoot those types of issues.
Yeah, John, you couldn't be more right. So it's funny. I have one of my longest standing account. I've been working with him for over 20 years. Great company, and I love working with him. It's funny uh, how many times I get drug into these calls that they're like, "Hey, we need help with the network," and it goes back to my thing of, you know, what are they reporting versus what's the reality, right? And in my head, I know, and I know that obviously I've been there for over 20 years. I know the account quite well, but they're saying like, hey, we're having a lot of problems with networking. I know you're not really having problems with networking. You're having problems with your application. But as the network architect, I'm what ties that application to the network. And I'm just in a better position at times to troubleshoot it. And yeah, you could have challenges with, you know, TLS versions or SMB versions. I had a really, really bad one several years ago now with the SMB versioning issue and a WAN optimizer from Riverbed. But yeah, all these things play a part, and it does fall a lot of times on the networking team, and it's really painful in the moment. I think it's really good because it keeps us in the heart of everything, right? The one nice thing about the network is everything flows across the network, right? So it is good, I think, for our careers, but it does lead to some high blood pressure moments. It sounds like you've had a few of those, John. I've had more than my own share over the years as well. So fair point. Okay. Like I said, we're in the home stretch. Let's talk about breaking down some problems. What if someone says they cannot reach something, right? And of course, we're always going to remember our earliest steps about doing, different ways to quantify the problem, right? What's the real problem? What's the real scope? What changed? When was it last reachable? And this can be a really critical question. I've had that happen with firewalls before, where you're doing some kind of a firewall change or a firewall cut or something. And they'll say like, well, I can't get to this server. When was it last reachable? Oh, I don't know. And it can be really hard to go back in time and look at that kind of stuff, right? So, but knowing when something was last reachable is, we had one with wireless access point. Hey, this wireless access point over here shows it's down on our management tool. It's like, well, when was it last reachable? Ooh, I don't know. They go back and look at the tool and they're like, oh, I guess it hasn't been reachable for 3 weeks. And then someone else, remember I said you're always listening to what has changed? Someone else said, oh, they are remodeling that part of the building. They probably took the AP down temporarily while they're doing the remodel. Ah, okay. Right. So you're always keeping your ears open for those things. Once we've done those things, we just work the stack, right? You can't reach something. So do I have a link light? Has the cabling been messed with? That's kind of another way of asking, what changed, right? And that link light goes both directions, on the source and on the destination. What's the MAC, source and destination, right? Can I see that MAC on a port? Is there a trunk or an ether channel involved, right? Pings, trace routes are both hosts in their respective ARC tables. Am I seeing any route flapping? Remember, I mentioned earlier, I've mentioned it a few times, having good logging is really critical to troubleshooting, right? So keep that in mind. Is it behind a firewall or a load balancer? And did either of those things change? Some companies, the firewalls and the load balancers may be managed by a team other than the networking team. Sometimes they're managed directly by the networking team. I see it both ways quite often, right? So there could have been a change on a firewall or a load balancer. I was mentioning that VDI problem I had a few months ago, where there was a change on the firewall, and the network team in that case doesn't manage or control the firewalls. And so we were not aware of that change until someone from InfoSec came on, and I'm not blaming InfoSec whatsoever, because they came on right away and said, well, we did make a policy change last night. Okay, that helps a lot. Here's the source IP. Can you tell me if you're seeing traffic drop? Yeah, I am seeing traffic drop from that IP. Okay, but now we can get into the meat of why this is going on, right? And this is another good example of what John brought up, where it's not really a network issue, it's a firewall issue. And in this case, the network team doesn't control the firewalls, but the network team is in the enviable or unenviable position, depending on how you look at such things, of being an expert at the way things are flowing and being able to see both sides. You're the person who can see on both sides of the firewall, right? Maybe you can't see what's going on in the firewall, but you can see everything going out to the firewall. You can see everything potentially coming out from the firewall. So you have a pretty good idea what's going on in that firewall. A service is down. Oh, this says down. It should say slow. Sorry, this is copy and paste error. Should say a service is slow. This is really hard to troubleshoot compared to something being down. Something being down is pretty quantifiable, right? Something being slow is a lot more difficult to quantify. I deal with this, for those who don't know me very well, I do a lot of networking in AWS. I do a lot of cloud networking. And I get a lot of people who say, hey, I moved my app up to AWS, and now when I try to do X, it's really, really slow. And it's kind of like, okay, where was the app before? Oh, it was in the data center here at HQ. Well, you were probably 1 millisecond from that server before, right? What's your trace route look like to that server now? Oh, it's about 10 milliseconds. Okay, where is it at? Oh, it's up in Northern California. Ah, well, that's about right. It doesn't mean that the app is any slower. It means your distance from the app has gone up by 10x or something along those lines, right? So slowness can be a little bit trickier because it's harder to quantify what this slowness actually means. This is another one where packet captures can also be helpful. Are you getting lots of retransmits or something like that? At layer 2, we could probably skip layer 1. I'm not saying we definitely can skip layer 1. You could be getting like lots of interface resets or high error rate on a circuit or something like that. But you're probably more likely to go to layer 2 and say things like, am I getting interface errors or interface resets, as opposed to, do I have a link light? If the service is up but slow, you probably have a link light, but you may have errors with lots of resets or something. Are there any in-path devices like firewalls, load balancers, WAN optimizers, right? Checking logs, whether it's a log on a box or off box, but things like, are my routing adjacencies flapping, right? So let me I should have said slow. My OCD's kicking in. Inconsistent reachability. Hey, I can't reach, everything, something, this thing, but others can, right? Or I can reach it sometimes, but not others. So this is another one, kind of like slowness. When we have inconsistencies, we have to ask those questions to try to box that in and try to understand what seems to be causing it. What's the common underlying threads here that cause this reachability issue, right? Are you the only one experiencing this reachability issue? Are there other people in the company experiencing it? Are they just in your general vicinity, or are they in other branches, or is it your entire branch? We need to narrow that scope down a little bit, right? We definitely need to hit layer 1 here, wired and wireless, right? Can they ping their gateway? Are they getting a proper IP address? Things like that. Can you see their MAC address, right? Layer 3. Now, at layer 3, if it's a single host at a site and everyone else is working except that host, it's probably not a routing issue, right? I get this a lot with AWS people that I work with, where they're like, oh, I can't route to this IP address. Well, we don't route to IP addresses, we route to networks. So, or, hey, my IP address isn't in the routing table. Well, IP addresses don't go in the routing table. Destination prefixes go in the routing table, right? But, if it's a group of devices at a site, we do need to check the routes at both directions. Are we taking maybe an asymmetric path, and is that causing issues? Asymmetry isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a really bad thing if we have things like network appliances in the path, right? If I have a firewall on one leg of the journey, but no firewall on the other leg of the journey, or vice versa, that could be really problematic, right? Same thing with a load balancer. The load balancer needs to see both sides of that connection to properly function. My management solution is down. This one actually came up pretty recently. Hey, my management system is saying everything's down. I think my whole network's down. Okay, well, your phone is on the network and you're calling me from your phone. I don't think the whole network's down. What's the management station saying exactly, right? I would kind of take a look at it. In that particular case, it turned out what was down was the network connection for the management station. So yeah, it saw everything down because it couldn't talk to anything because it was offline, right? But it's a little bit different when you have to troubleshoot things like your management solution. And obviously there might be very specific things you could do on different management solutions. I can't go into that or speak to that. But generally speaking, some things we want to look at, have there been any SNMP changes? And when I think of SNMP changes, I think about things like we do a lot of SNMP v2 to v3, and we always use automation for it. Now, we've been doing network automation for quite a while, so we don't really make those mistakes. But early on when we were testing this, it was nerve-wracking because automation's great, but it's also really efficient at breaking things, right? It can break everything at once at all places because it's automated. So, but just in general, this is kind of like what has changed? We're just going back to our basic steps again. Check the logs. Can you correlate those logs with anything that's going on with this outage? Oh, this is interesting. You know, um, I see a bunch of port 445 traffic spiking at the same time people started saying, or at the same time that my management solution said that a bunch of things were going down. I've got something going on port 445. Do I maybe have some malware or a 0-day or something? Right? And we're just going to work the layers, and we're going to work the layers of the NMS itself. If it's saying everything is down, and we know that not everything is down because other people are working, then we're going to work through all 4 layers, but we're going to do it from the perspective of the NMS. Why is the NMS not able to reach the items that it wants to manage, right? Okay, this is our last slide. Um, Tips for troubleshooting in real time. So, I've given a lot of advice here. Hopefully, some of it you found to be pretty useful. Or hopefully some of it you will find to be pretty useful at some point. Hopefully not too soon. I don't want anyone to have to get on outage bridges, but it does happen, right? And I've spent a lot of my career doing troubleshooting. That's kind of what I used to specialize in most, probably. Uh, and so over the years, I've come up with some general thoughts on how to do troubleshooting in real time. And my top one is so basic, it might seem counterintuitive, but I try to take notes on everything I do. And in fact, preferably I do it as I'm making changes. So what I like to do is I bring up Notepad++, and if I know I need to make a change, I type the whole change out in Notepad++, and then I copy and paste it into the router, the switch, the firewall, whatever it is I'm changing. And that way I have an exact copy of what went in and what order it went in, right? And some of you might say like, hey, wait a second, that's what we have TACAX for or something like that. And yes, you're right. You may have some AAA accounting that covers that, which is great, and that's a good practice. Not everyone does. It also just slows me down a little bit to make sure I'm looking at this. And I could copy and paste that to a colleague as well. I could say, hey, Christina, I'm about to paste this in. Can you just give it a once over? Does this make sense to you? And she might catch it and say, hey, Jason, you misspelled VLAN on VLAN 3. You spelled it VALN instead of VLAN. Oh, okay. Thank you, Christina. I appreciate that. And I can go change that or something. So I can't always do this, but I try to always do it, right? It's pretty rare that I don't type out my commands into a text editor before I put them in any live device. I try to always listen and stay alert to understand what the customer's saying, doing, what's going on. Like I said, in a live, real-time troubleshooting situation, things can change. Someone may tell you early on, yeah, this worked this worked until about 5 minutes ago. And then maybe 20 minutes later, someone else comes on and says, no, we haven't been able to hit that website for the last 2 weeks. We just thought that maybe the website got retired. We have this workaround. And it's like, wait a second, someone earlier said it was working up until 5 minutes ago. And now I've got 2 conflicting pieces of information that gives me something to kind of hold on to and chase down. And it might be nothing that helps me, but it might be something that changes the day, right? When the InfoSec team comes in and says, actually, we did push a change last night. Oh, okay. I was told there were no changes, but it turns out there was a change. I was just asking the wrong group, were there any changes, right? Always update docs. I can't tell, my customers would probably save a lot of money if they just kept up to date on their docs, right? There's so many times where we say, hey, do you have any kind of network documentation? Can I look at something to see how things are working? And they give me something and I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, you know what? You mentioned that we're 20 sites on your WAN, but I only see 8. Oh, yeah, we did an acquisition a couple of years ago, and I haven't drawn the other 12 sites yet. Okay, well, now I'm going to have to recommend I do a network audit or something like that, right? So in my best interest, it's great. Don't keep your docs up to date. But honestly, I think it makes everyone's life a lot better if we just do that. We just take that simple step, update our documentation. I say real time, really, some documentation gets updated more in near real time. If you took really good notes on bullet point 1, go get some sleep, go get a cup of coffee, freshen up, and then come back and update your docs. And last step is always send a summary on what the issue was, what steps were taken, and what the final resolution was, if there was one, right? And that's super important. Again, you want to be sure that everyone's on the same page. Hey, we had an outage. Here's how it presented. Here's what really happened. Here's what steps we took. And here's how we resolved it. Because sometimes those resolutions are temporary, sometimes they're permanent. Sometimes they need to be reviewed before we understand them, right? So this kind of goes back to the very, very first slide where I talked about communicate early, often, and clearly. This is kind of similar. At the end of a troubleshooting session, always take the time to send out a summary of what the issue was, what steps were taken, and what resolution you came to. And the resolution might be troubleshooting's ongoing, and I'm now handing this off to the European team because my shift is ending, right? So that's a valid resolution, right? If you have a real live incident going on or something like that, right? It's a resolution not for the issue, it's a resolution for you and the end of your work on that resolution at that time. And that's really it. Let me just stop the share. Let me look real quick. Are there... Yes, so someone else just brought up they have had issues with a lack of documentation, diagrams, etc. Yeah, it happens all the time, Ron. You're not alone there. So I think that's all I had to go over. Did anyone have any questions, comments, or thoughts?
Yes, I'll ask you a question. I had this discussion with my team just yesterday, in fact. Have you ever been on a either an outage or a change where you had, 5, 6, 7 terminals open at the same time, and you typed the command in the wrong terminal?
So I can't remember if I've ever done that myself, but one of the biggest outages I was ever involved in, that's exactly what happened. So a guy I was working with had 2 terminals open. One was a production piece of equipment. One was a piece of equipment in a lab, and he was trying to replicate an issue he was having a config. And he wanted to start over in the lab, so he did a write erase and reload, and he did it on the production piece of gear.
So here's what I've been doing for years. I actually use like 3 or 4 different terminal programs. But I've got TerraTerm for one purpose, and I have it set up with a red background with white text. And that's always the terminal where the change is happening. Anything else gets opened in a black screen. So that's how I prevent myself from making that kind of mistake. And I find that a lot of people find that surprising when I tell them about it, and they say, "Hey, that's a really good idea." Why didn't
No,
I
it
think of
is.
that?
Yeah. And so much, and this is one reason why troubleshooting is so hard to teach generally, right? In the general, it's because it's filled with these little moments of like, well, I had this happen, and so I'll never do that again, right? And yeah, this gentleman I worked with, really good engineer, he just made a goofy mistake, but he did a write erase on a production device and then reloaded it, and it was suddenly like, oh my goodness, it was
Yeah,
it was at a manufacturing site. So we were able to recover the config quickly. We had backups, but it still took 10 minutes to get everything back up and working in a manufacturing facility. That's not a good look.
yeah. They measure
Yeah, yeah,
outages in dollars per minute. Um,
yes.
yeah, the only other comment really generally is that uh, I have a practice of logging everything all the time. So I use Secure CRT, and I just set up logging by default and
Yep.
log the files. So especially for an extended outage, you're not going to remember everything that you did, but
Nope.
it's there,
Yeah.
it's right there in the log.
Yeah, I didn't bring that up. I've done that quite a bit in both Secure CRT and in Putty. Um, because it just depends on where I'm working, which terminal program I might be using. Um, so yeah, that's a good one right there. Is turn logging on in whatever your terminal program is. That way you have, I mean, it's long and laborious, but it's not slowing you down, and it allows you to do those forensics after the fact. That's a great suggestion.
And you
Thank you.
mentioned plus plus. So um, I know in Secure CRT, when you've got the log file open, you can actually open it concurrently in Notepad++ and turn on tail, and then you've
Oh,
got
mm-hmm.
an infinite scroll back.
Mm-hmm.
So you can scroll back to see something that you did in the history, and you still have the live terminal. You can just copy and paste or type it right in, and you're not constantly scrolling back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of, yeah, there are so many of these little things, and those are all, yeah, great tips. And I use Notepad++. You know, I don't necessarily endorse that one. What I really endorse is just keeping a notepad or a text editor or something that you can take your notes in. I
Sure.
always have, by the way, I'm very old school. I always have a notepad with me as well, like a physical notepad. And so when I'm a picture person, any of my coworkers that are on this call know I'm drawing pictures all the time. And as I'm troubleshooting something, I'm doodling it out, right? Because whenever I get this resolved, one of my first steps is updating documentation. I'm going to do a Visio for this or update the existing Visios. Like, oh, no one told us that they put this, new WAN optimizer in line. Okay, I need to add this in and I need to document it. Or, oh, no one knew that this app worked in this way, right? And so those are all critical things. Okay, I think that about covers it for tonight. I think this was, hopefully you guys got something good out of this session. Doug, did you have another question? I saw your hand was raised, but I think it might have been raised from when you'd asked the point or brought up the point before. Yeah, okay, you brought it back then. Okay. So I think Doug was bringing it had it raised before when we were talking about Wireshark. So hopefully everyone got something from this. Um, if you do have questions, you'd like a copy of the slides, any of those sorts of things, you can email me. In about a week, this should be up on the scug.net website. And then it'll be also on the LA Networks YouTube channel for the recording. Okay. Oh, speaking of which, I'll turn off the recording now.
Need help? Call our cybersecurity team and book a consultation with us today.